Behind the Title is a candid and surprising behind-the-curtain documentary series that unearths the surprising insights and stories that dispels the assumed myths of people with titles and privileges. In essence, the paradox of privilege. Ruby Malloch talks to the Honourable Alexandra Foley from one of England's most noble families about the royal portrait given to her grandfather, the 7th Baron Foley, by Queen Victoria in memoriam for Prince Albert. The 7th Lord Foley entertained at Whitley Court and his other estates in Worcestershire and the Black Country.
Good morning, darling Alex. We're sitting beneath this wonderful portrait that Queen Victoria gave to your grandfather. She, in fact, gave this portrait to 100 close friends in memoriam of Prince Albert when he died. How did you inherit this marvelous piece of history?
Good to see you, Ruby. Yes, it's interesting. Well, my father asked me to collect this picture from his house in Belgravia, and he explained to me over the telephone that it was very important. Apparently, Queen Victoria gave 100 of these to her friends about a year after Albert died. And what's interesting about this picture is not really the picture itself, although it's interesting that, of course, they're signed by Victoria and by Albert posthumously, obviously. But what's interesting is the frame. Each frame was custom made for each individual friend. So in this case, at the top it says in memoriam, and at the bottom it says to Lord Foley, January 1862. That was exactly a year after Albert died. And they're quite rare. In fact, I don't know who else whether they survived, because the frame is quite delicate. In fact, it took 4 men to get the picture hung in my old house, and the same to my new little flat here. It's extremely heavy, weighs almost 200 pounds.
The Foleys were one of the richest and grandest families of the 17th century. They had many estates where they entertained royals and nobility and were enormously diligent about philanthropy and politics. Coming from such an illustrious background, everyone assumes that you must live a life of grandeur and privilege. How true is this?
Actually, completely untrue. An enormous myth. In fact, I've been working since I had a very good education. My parents were very good, but I was brought up by a nanny. My parents were separated when I was 3. My father lived, in the States. My mother lived in Switzerland. Brought up by a nanny. I went to work when I was 15, having done a secretarial course. I've had to work very hard all my life, and like a lot of these grand families, unfortunately, my brother and I sit at the bottom end of the bell curve, or the hockey stick. We are sort of the peak of the family fortune was unfortunately well before my grandfather was born. Although my grandfather inherited this picture, would be considered today to be extremely rich. But unfortunately, my father's mother managed to go through the family fortune, having spent a great deal of money in buying marvellous collections of beautiful haute couture clothes, which are now all, rather to my annoyance, in the V&A Museum, amongst others. So no, I mean, I've had to work very hard and have had a very unconventional life, and have lived a lot of it out of a suitcase, and had to move around a lot, and had to be extremely resourceful, and have had to adapt a great deal. And so it's a myth, but any resemblance to a sort of Downton Abbey life is not unfortunately the case.
What is your name, please?
My name is Adrian Gerald Lord Foley.
What is your name, please?
My name is Adrian Gerald Lord Foley.
What is your name, please?
My name is Adrian Gerald Lord Foley.
Two of these people are imposters. Only one of them is the real Adrian Lord Foley and is the only one sworn to tell the truth.
Your father was rather an unusual and a very unconventional man who also happened to be a gifted pianist. In fact, he was called the Liberace of England. What are your memories of your father?
Well, I mean, he was very unusual. He never went to school. That wouldn't be allowed today because he was tutored privately. He was a brilliant at maths and very philosophical, extremely well read. He was tall and glamorous and was the life of the party. Although he only drank Coca-Cola, he was well known and internationally. The Americans loved him. He made an awful lot of records in the 1950s, which are still available today. And he was a highly unusual personality because he wasn't at all conventional in an English sense. I mean, he'd never lived in the English countryside. He absolutely hated it because it was freezing cold. And he was much more of a kind of international kind of personality.
You are Lord Foley, Baron of Kidderminster. Now, what do your friends call you for short?
Well, some of them call me Fofo.
What do you who?
Fofo.
He also lived to play the piano, and he was also a favorite of the Queen Mother.
Yes, well, the Queen Mother loved him. And in fact, we are distantly related to the Bowes-Lyon family. And she used to ring him up and say, "Fo, I'm giving a dinner party. I want you to come, and I want you to play the piano afterwards." And of course, he would not have very much excuse to say no. He loved her very much as of her sense of humour. And so that happened a lot, yes. And so he used to tinkle the ivories and...
Your father entertained enormously in Marbella. What are your childhood memories of that?
Well, yes, I mean, I was sent to Marbella on a 2-week holiday and then told I wasn't coming back, which was a little bit of a shock. And I went from a very provincial life in Sussex with my nanny to an extremely uberly glamorous time. I mean, I basically, my father was great friends of Alfonso Hohenlohe, who started the Marbella Club, having been inspired by his father. So I grew up with all the German nobles who were down there because Alfonso had sort of said, "Come here, you know, come and stay." And so we had my stepmother built a huge house, probably the largest in Marbella in the late 60s. And my memories are of these incredibly glamorous parties, 300 or 400 people, people beautifully dressed. And the downside was I had to go to this very strange school, which was a converted hotel on a beach, where there were boys, and I'd never boarded either. So I mean, I had to again adapt. It was very emotionally tough because I missed my school friends and my nanny, and but I was there in the heyday of Marbella, basically in the 70s. So, and now of course it is quite romantic to look back on those times. My father had a beautiful music room with his Steinway piano where he entertained my stepmother and Shirley Bassey, Sean Connery, Stuart Granger came to play gin rummy practically every day. Sean Connery played golf with my father every week. It was full of people like that and quite, very amusing.
Alex, you had some very interesting godparents, including Jo Hartford, the sister of Huntington Hartford, and her husband, Ivor Bryce, who was very instrumental in helping Ian Fleming create James Bond. Can you share more of the interesting stories about that with us?
Her husband, Ivor Bryce, who was half Peruvian, they used to come and stay with us in Marbella all the time. And of course, Ivor was great friends, best friend with Ian Fleming, because Ian Fleming was in naval intelligence. And because Ivor was half Peruvian, he was basically involved in South American intelligence. And he used to go and stay with Ian Fleming at GoldenEye regularly. And he was envious because, of course, Ian's stories were a bit more glamorous. He saw a lot more action than did Ivor, who was stuck over in the Americas. And one day, Ivor managed to persuade Ian to write his memoirs. And he said, well, I'm not going to do it literally, but I'll sort of do it as a fictitious character, but I will do it on one condition. The character's got to have a sort of classless name. And so Ivor looked up into the rather sparse library, and he saw this book, Birds of the West Indies by James Bond. He said, well, that's an innocuous name. James Bond was Britain's famous ornithologist. And so Ian Fleming agreed. And that is the story, which not many people know, in fact. Just a few handful of people know that story.
Alex, we saw you earlier target practicing, and you happen to own a very special gun. Tell us more about that.
Well, as you can imagine, working at Sotheby's for nearly 14 and a half years and being a bit of a gun nut, a self-confessed gun nut, and being a James Bond fan for obvious reasons, I had to have the iconic Bond semi-automatic pistol, which of course is in reality an LP-53, a Walther air pistol. And the reason for that is because when the poster was being made, the iconic poster with Sean Connery holding it in this position, somebody forgot the semi-automatic pistol. And a cameraman on the set said, well, I've got my air pistol. And he went to fetch it, and this was it.
Your very first job was at Sotheby's in the arms, armour and sporting guns department. How was that experience?
Yes, well, I was sent to work, as I said, when I was very, very young. My stepmother was a very good friend of Peter Wilson, who was the then chairman of Sotheby's. When I was 17, I was living in Los Angeles, and I owed her $400 because I had to have a car. You can't not have a car in LA, so I bought a fourth-hand Ford Pinto, one of the exploding variety, and I was sent off to work at Sotheby's in LA, and as a secretary, because I was a fully trained typist and could do Pitman's shorthand. Right. So and then after many a couple of years, I managed to wheedle my way into the gun department, and the guy who ran the gun department, who I was very fond of, but he was an alcoholic and was usually drunk after about 12 o'clock, so I had to take over cataloguing the guns and handling stuff, and so I rose up through the ranks, got myself back to England, eventually became the first female porter, and then again managed to wheedle myself in that department, where I gradually rose up through the ranks and became a fully fledged cataloguer and so-called expert, not only doing firearms but also specialising in shotguns, sporting guns.
Number two, how did you become a member of the House of Lords?
Well, actually, I couldn't help it.
You couldn't help it?
You see, my father was one before me.
Oh, I see. It sort of goes down.
That's right.
Or, pardon me, up or whatever.
In your opinion, what does the future of the British aristocracy hold?
Well, I think obviously things have changed dramatically since my father's era. I think the key to the British aristocracy's success has been its ability to adapt. And I'm not sure whether my brother, who's inherited the title, whether he'll ever sit in the House of Lords, whether our cousin, his son, will ever sit in the House of Lords. I think, I've got a feeling things are going to be, further downsized, further diluted. I'm not sure that it's, the grand houses are still there. People are having children. They're being looked after. So I'm fairly upbeat about it, but I think it's going to be, a much more economical version than, the old days, and rather in the same way as, between the wars era was so grand, and then after the last war things went down a notch, and now I think it's, I think one hopefully is just going to have to carry on with a noblesse oblige, but perhaps without all the trappings. But in general, I think we just have to truck on, basically.
Coming from a background of land, academia, and tribal, as a child, one of the things I was taught was the importance of all human beings being equal, but just by God's grace, they happen to occupy different positions. And my grandmother, BBG, was a great living example of that for me. And I remember the first time I met Prince Charles and the late Princess Diana. I was at school and I decided to wear my tribal outfit, which also had a very ornate headpiece. And on meeting Prince Charles, he sort of turned to me and he said, "Are you an Indian princess?" And I remember at that point just feeling very proud of my heritage and having that indelible, impactful sort of sense of, heritage that serves me well in life. What is the one thing that has had that is kind of part of you, that is part of your heritage, that serves you well in life?
Yes, well, I think the minute my father gave me my family ring, it made me feel, that I was worth something. And then I think being asked to take Prince Charles around the ruins of my ancestral home, apparently is his favourite ruin, Whitley Court, with the head of English Heritage, particularly to our family church. That made me feel very proud, and it sort of made me realise that I'm rooted in history, and that despite my unconventional life and having to live out of a suitcase and moving around, that essentially I'm very lucky that I've got this anchor, which is history, which you can't take away. And I felt very proud. And then when Prince Charles turned round to me and said, after I'd showed him the pile, and then he turned back to me and he said, "Alex, where do you live now?" And I said, "Well, sir, I live in a very modest flat in SW10.
I'm sure you must have found that very amusing.
Yeah, he did, yes.
Yeah, well, he told me his favourite was tandoori chicken, which
Yeah.
was very nice to learn because it
Well,
is a
well, he
good
has
dish.
a wonderful sense of humour, and it was a beautiful day. That.
Yeah, well, thank you for that wonderful chat, Alex.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, Ruby. Lovely to see you as always.
Same, likewise.